Well, good morning. Am I muted? Okay. Can anyone hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, thanks, guys. I'm using a different computer than what I usually do. I'm in a different environment than where I usually am. And you never can tell when you switch up your normal kind of routine and your normal technology. It's always a crapshoot. We've got a couple minutes, so I'm just gonna chill and click buttons. What do these do? Oh, cool. Did not know that button was there. This is the part of the semester where your Luddite professor just starts clicking random buttons and just sees what's this button do? You know, it's just like kind of like, I'm the old prospector. I've never used Zoom before. And it's like, I know I've used Zoom, but I use like 10% of Zoom. Now I'm just kind of exploring the space because you guys already know I'm crazy. Anything fresh and exciting going on in your guys' lives? Anything happening? Any vaccines or anything? Any cool stuff?
I got my first vaccine dose on the 6th.
Congratulations, Jenna. Was it Moderna, Pfizer?
Pfizer.
I hear so far from all of the like random anecdotes I've collected, Pfizer seems to be like the best one in terms of like minimal side effects and availability and things like that. I got Moderna and it just crushed me. The second dose just laid me out for like 24 hours.
That's how it was with me, but that happened when I got the first dose, and then I'm getting the second dose next week, and I'm like, if I got sick with the first dose, am I just gonna be like chill with the second one? I hope.
I hope so. Yeah, sometimes that happens. Yeah, you might get lucky, and yeah, that could very well be the case. It's just so random. It's all just so random in terms of like what happens, and I don't think there's any correlation between like the different type of vaccine and like the age of the person and the blah 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 blah. It all seems just entirely random. But anyway, I'm glad we're getting there. I'm glad it's really kind of awesome to hear you guys getting yours, just with how young you are and with how like basically now it's open to the public, right? So it's really exciting to see that you guys are able to get the vaccine if you want it. It means we're speeding along really fast in terms of getting the population immunized so we can all go back and play, you know, back to normal.
And when's that gonna happen?
When's normal gonna happen?
Yeah.
That's a really good question, Randall. I wish I knew. I think, so this is my, you know, I'm just a doctor, but not that doctor kind of doctor opinion. I think by the time like the fall semester, you know, if you guys are still in school, doing more school stuff in the fall, you know, we're going to be like Lincoln Land's going to be back on campus. We're going to be, I don't know what kind of mitigations we'll have, like maybe like smaller classrooms or, you know, maybe still seated apart or something like that, maybe masks or something, but we're largely going to be back, you know, normal. I think we'll have like sporting events and concerts again sometime in the fall, maybe late 2021 or something like that. In Illinois, anyway. I have family in Indiana, and they're already doing live music and stuff, but that's Indiana. And, well, um, yeah, I think it's in the next few months. You know, I think we'll be back to like 75% normal, whatever that means. That's a good question. All right, so today, let's just do it. I feel like I say this every week, you know, that okay, we're good. That, you know, this is going to be a relatively brief class. We haven't done a Tuesday class in a long time, and it's basically just helping you, like this. In part, this is geared towards the quiz. For this week, and in part just usually what I do is I spend like 2 full weeks on the content of the Cold War. I've moved away from doing that in recent years just because like the Cold War seems more like ancient history now than it used to. You know, back in the like 2000s, like the Cold War was like 20 years ago, and now it's, you know, it feels like it's basically 40 years ago or more. And I don't know. I don't think people care as much about the Cold War, but we're still going to talk about it. We're just going to do it in a very brief, like nutshell kind of way, and focusing on Europe, like what happens in Europe and how the U.S. kind of takes over as the center of Western civilization. So that's kind of one of the main things I want to communicate this morning is that Europe used to be the beating heart of Western civilization. And then World War II happens and they tear themselves apart again for the second time in 40 years. Europe just kind of implodes. And so that means America is basically the leader of the free world, right? Just in time for the Cold War to kick off. So we're going to talk about what that means for Europe, because we spent so many weeks just talking about Western civilization in the European context. So we're going to talk about what that means for Europe, and then kind of, you know, how things play out in the Cold War. And so it's a very kind of nutshell approach to the Cold War. We'll talk about the end of the Cold War next week, how it all kind of wraps up, and then we're going to start the last couple of weeks of the class. We'll talk about more modern problems. Hooray, modern problems. And I'm not quite sure how I want to do that, because I would like to talk about sort of modern politics a little bit, but without getting into like, you know, I'm not here to like sway anyone's politics. That's not my job. So anyway, okay. So bear with me as we kind of talk about this. Feel free to take notes and whatnot. There's some stuff up here. There's some stuff in here I think that you'll find that is helpful in terms of doing your quiz for this week if you haven't done that already. But it also is going to help position you in terms of writing your Berry-Loss analysis paper also. So after World War II, obviously massive destruction, right? If you've read the segment of the textbook that you're supposed to, it's, sorry, there's a garbage truck outside the window. World War II is devastating for Europe. Cities are leveled, fire bombings of cities take place on both sides, you know, with even more destructive technology like tanks and airplanes, or sophisticated versions of those anyway. We get a lot more destruction. And that's basically very crippling for what used to be the center of Western civilization, right? Which is Western Europe. Because, you know, France, Germany, parts of Great Britain, the Netherlands, Belgium, Russia, you know, these are all major theaters of war. And so we see the lack of viable infrastructure. So, you know, roads have been targeted by bombers, railroads have been targeted. It's hard. It's hard to move things from place to place because infrastructure, in the broad sense of that word, is just like crippled and gone. So it's hard to move people and food around. It's hard to, you know, it's hard to get Europe back on its feet. We also have the targeted destruction because it is total war after all in World War II. The target destruction of agricultural lands in France and Germany, you know, the other kind of like very fertile places, Ukraine, out east, Russia, large tracts of land are just completely bombed out and burned. And so it's, you know, crops are set back. It's very hard to bring food where there is none because of infrastructure and food supply problems. And not only that, you know, even the people, the countries that win the war, Great Britain, France, they have massive national debts because they geared their whole economies towards fighting this conflict just 30 years after fighting the last big war as well. So Britain and France used to be, you know, the centers of Western civilization in some ways, and they are incredibly indebted, in really bad shape, despite coming out on the winning side of the war. So in a sense, there kind of are no winners in World War II, except the United States, which comes out with, as a creditor nation, you know, like our economy is booming. A lot of our infrastructure is still in place because the war was not fought in North America. And really the United States is the only country that comes out of this looking really good, which is great for us and bad for everybody else, including our allies. Massive displacement after World War II. 7 million people are on the move because of loss of home, or just a lack of safe, like they can't go back to their countries of origin because of whatever reason. Personal anecdote here, my grandparents, so my last name is Schoner, right? Really weird last name. You've probably never seen it before. It's a Ukrainian name. But when my grandparents arrived in Ellis Island, they gave us like a German spelling of a Ukrainian name because they couldn't figure out how to translate Jovnir to like English. And so they just kind of came up with this wonky spelling of a Ukrainian name. So my grandparents fled Ukraine during World War II. They couldn't go back to Ukraine because Stalin and the USSR were just as nasty to the Ukrainians as the Germans were. So like there's no going home. They made it to the United States eventually after years of being refugees. So I have that kind of personal anecdote in my back pocket from my grandparents. And you kind of place that in context with the number of like, take that times 7 million. And that's, you know, how many people are kind of just roving around desperate for a place to land. So you can see the challenge then after World War II of trying to deal with a post-war world in which, you know, there's a lack of food. When we do have food, we can't get it to the places that need food. And there are just people wandering around everywhere. Like it's a humanitarian disaster, right?
It's also a disaster. And don't forget the concentration camp, because there's people there that got to be fed too as well.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, so liberation of concentration camps, you know, can these interned Jews or you know, other groups that are interned, you know, like, are we able, would it be humane just to like put them on a train and send them back to Poland, right? Or Germany? They've got nothing back home. So what do we do, right? Yeah, good. So this is where the Marshall Plan steps in. Europe can't fix itself. It doesn't have the resources. It's completely dependent on outside aid. And like I said, the United States is the only country that's in any kind of shape to help anybody after the war, because we have resources, we have capital, and the U.S. is where people turn to, not just in the West, but really all over the world. They're applying for American aid, and the Marshall Plan comes in. And the Marshall Plan is, at the time, like we talk about billions being spent every day, trillions of dollars, you know, like the American Rescue Plan, the big bill that was passed a few weeks ago, it's like $2 trillion. we're talking about $2 trillion infrastructure plan today. With the rate of inflation, you know, the numbers kind of just get bigger and bigger and bigger since the 40s, but $17 billion was a big deal for the time. Like, that's a lot of money that the United States just kind of allocates towards foreign aid. And, you know, it looks like small peanuts today. You know, the Biden military, the part of the Biden budget that's being released is spending $1 billion a day on the military. Compare that to, you know, $17 billion total allocated towards the Marshall Plan, and it looks like small peanuts, but at the time it was an insane amount of money, and that money was allocated towards different ways to help Europe rebuild itself. A huge part of that pot of money was just dedicated towards purchasing food to ship to Europe because people are starving to death. Like, a lot of people are starving. But also, you know, funding aid workers to go in and do all kinds of things, help repair infrastructure, social services, you know, funding orphanages for kids who lost their parents, job programs for people who are out of work, stuff like that. And also just plain cash payments so that countries like France and Britain can actually have some kind of operating income or operating budget, you know, for the next couple of years after war. So the Marshall Plan is the United States' kind of answer to, like, hey, we have all this booming economy, we have all this capital. How can we use it in a way that kind of helps rebuild Europe? And there's a few different, like, motives for this. Like, obviously there's the humanitarian part of it. We don't want to see millions of people in Europe starve, right? That's bad. But also, if we don't do this, if we don't step in, the United States, then Russia will, right? The Soviet Union is the only other kind of functioning country in Europe. And with their kind of eagerness to spread communism, they're going to step in and they're going to help these nations rebuild if the US doesn't do it. So part of it is humanitarianism, part of it is just politics and wanting to shore up the loyalty of Western Europe to be on the side of capitalism and democracy rather than authoritarian communism. Okay. So speaking of the Soviet Union, we get the rise of two superpowers after the Cold War, or after World War II. There used to be, you know, several nations that all kind of shared power, had like a balance of power: France, Germany, Britain, Japan, the United States, Russia, maybe Italy in there. Maybe you could talk about Turkey too. But all the kind of power, because of the destructiveness of the war, all the power shifts to the poles, to the far west and the far east. And we call this the age of superpowers. So the United States and the Soviet Union become superpowers because the other kind of rival claimants for, like, top dog in the global food chain, Germany, France, Britain, they have massive problems because of the war. All the power, all the functional power basically in the world belongs to these two countries, the US and Soviet Union. Everyone else very quickly finds themselves as kind of pawns on the chessboard of geopolitics between these two countries. That's the Cold War. That's the Cold War, is these two countries, the US and Soviet Union, battling for supremacy in the post-war period, and no one else can get in their way. And you start to see the polarization of the world between gravitating towards either of these two centers of power. Western Europe, obviously, you know, these are democratic countries, capitalistic countries. They gravitate towards the US, right? They're like, okay, that's our champion, right? And then the Marshall Plan kind of helps shore this up and secure this. And it was kind of a close call, because even a country as kind of with a a long-running democratic tradition like France, the first general election after the war in France, they almost voted to become communists. Like my first research paper in grad school was about the French Communist Party and how they almost took power in 1947, 1948, until the CIA, like the U.S. steps in and kind of helps put the kibosh on that. But like France almost went communist, or we could easily imagine a world in which they did. So the U.S. is really conscious of like, okay, we need to like flex our financial muscle to help maintain stability in democratic nations before the Soviet Union sweeps in and kind of helps turn everyone red. But this does happen in Eastern Europe. It's just closer to the Soviet Union. The Soviets press their advantage after the war. There's nothing that anybody in Poland or Ukraine or parts of the Balkans, parts of Scandinavia, there's nothing anyone can do to resist the spread of communism in Eastern Europe. It's just too close to USSR. And so Eastern Europe ends up being kind of falling into this Soviet block of power. And then you have countries that are on the fringe, kind of like in the middle. So I mentioned Poland, they definitely become communist. Hungary is in Central Europe. Czechoslovakia is in Central Europe. These countries resist for a time. In fact, they have kind of uprisings against communist rule, but they are crushed by the Soviet army, and they remain in the communist camp for the rest of the Cold War. To say nothing of Romania and also Eastern Germany. Germany gets cut in half as a result of World War II because, well, Germany was kind of the main combatant in both world wars, and the Allies figured it's safer to just split Germany in half rather than have it as a united country. We just can't trust those guys anymore, basically, was the idea.
And that's when the Berlin Wall comes in.
Yeah, Berlin Wall comes a little bit later. Yeah, you're right. I think we'll talk about that in just a second. So here's a map where you can see the division of Europe split into two halves, right? There's the pinko colonies on the right and American-led Freedom Coalition on the left. That's how we usually frame it, right, in traditional narratives. Freedom on the left, slavery on the right. And it's a little bit more complicated than that, but you know, from a traditional narrative, Europe is cut in half. It's split in half. And then if you're wondering about the green one, Yugoslavia, down there at the bottom, they're communists. That's a communist country, but they hate the Soviet Union. And so they remain outside of the influence of the Soviets, despite it being a communist nation itself. They want to go their own way, right? To quote Fleetwood Mac, they're going to go their own way. And they're kind of a weird, I don't know, they're just sort of a weird case. All the other gray countries are sort of neutral and are very, very conscious about not taking a side. So yeah, freedom on the left, hoorah, and then the Communist Party, which they tried to bill as like an actual party with hookers and booze on the right. So that's the way things are until basically the late 1980s and 1990. So for the next 50 years or so. The interesting thing about this though is France and Britain are in a state of denial about not being special anymore. They still, I mean, after all this, they're still running global empires that they set up in the 1880s or so. You know, Britain still has this huge global spanning empire in Africa, parts of the Pacific, and they're not ready to let that go. France as well. The big breaking point, and the Suez Canal has been in the news recently. You guys heard about that? The ship that was stuck?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Trouble in the sewage, yeah.
Okay, good. I'm glad. It was a fun meme for like a week, right? But the Suez But I think a lot of people learned about the Suez Canal from the ship being stuck. They're like, "What's that?" And they like Googled it, and turns out that's like a really important thing. But yeah, this waterway between the Mediterranean and the outlet to basically the Indian Ocean is where a lot of global trade passes through, even back then, even in the 1950s. And so that we had a crisis before the ship got stuck. There was another crisis in the Suez where the French and British and the Israelis, because now Israel is a country after World War II, they did a joint invasion of Egypt because Britain used to own the Suez Canal, like they used to control it. And then they gave it to Egypt with the promise of certain privileges. And then Egypt came under the control of kind of an authoritarian president and did not want the British involved. And so Britain, along with the help of their buddy France and Israel, long story short, they cooked up this invasion of Egypt to try and recolonize Egypt, just like the old days back when we set up colonies. But the interesting thing about this is the US sees this as a potential flashpoint between the West and the East, between the communist bloc and the Western bloc, NATO. Like a nuclear war could have possibly started over the Suez Canal and this invasion. And so the US said, guys, get out. We're not doing this, not right now. You're not setting up new colonies like you used to. Those days are over. And the US uses its financial muscle. Remember how we're giving all this free money to Britain and France? We threaten to shut off the tap of that free money if they don't get out of Egypt. And they do. Britain and France is like, okay, no, yeah, we're that desperate. We'll take the free cash over trying to reassert control over Egypt because we're just in bad shape. So the Suez crisis becomes this very embarrassing moment for Britain and France, and to a lesser extent Israel, although they're still chilling in the neighborhood. Britain and France realize we're not special anymore. We can't call the shots anymore. We have to get permission from the United States to do any kind of these adventures, colonial adventures abroad. Like the US is the boss in town now. Like we can't just go our own way anymore. And this is a very, very bright line that the US draws for its allies and says, like, you guys got to toe the line. We all have to stick together. You can't go on any crazy adventures and risk starting a global war because the US says so. And that's like the big moment when the US becomes, I mean, the US was already a superpower by then. But if there was any doubt in anyone's mind that Britain and France still rivaled American power abroad, it was over after the Suez crisis. So now you know something, now you have like an anecdote that you can share, with like your friends and family about like, aha, I know something else about the Suez besides the giant ship getting stuck a couple of weeks ago. Although that was fun to have all those memes for about a week and a half. That was a fun time. We all kind of the whole world just kind of rallied around memeing the Suez Canal. And, I like those moments of global cooperation. Anyway, another big outcome of the post-war period is the United Nations. You guys have heard of the UN, the United Nations. It replaces the League of Nations, which we didn't really talk about this in this class. League of Nations was kind of the rough draft version of the UN after World War I, and it was a complete and utter failure. It was completely toothless. Every country had like veto over a certain measure. So if like one country disagrees with a certain measure and everyone else decides to go along with it, then we can't do it because that one country had veto power. It was like that for everybody. So nothing got done. It wasn't funded. The United States was not a part of the League of Nations, even though Woodrow Wilson cooked up the idea in the first place. The US ended up not joining it. So from the very get-go, the League of Nations was this crappy you know, crappy robotic kind of prototype of of what becomes something more sophisticated after World War II. The U.S. joins the United Nations this time. We're like, we can't stay out of it. We have to help run the world because look what happens without us. It's headquartered in New York City. You can go and visit the UN building in New York today. They do tours and stuff. But it's mostly the same goals, right? It's trying to secure world peace, trying to prevent the outbreak of yet another world war. The UN also, after World War II and after the horrors of the Holocaust, and Randall kind of alluded to this a little bit, we don't want to see people put in concentration camps ever again, right? The horrors of the Holocaust and other human rights disasters that happened before and during World War II, or for that matter, Japanese internment camps in the United States on the West Coast, right? We want to, those are violations of human rights. And there coalesces this idea of human rights that people have inherent rights to, you know, life and liberty and, you know, pursuit of happiness, as we say in our documents, but also like people everywhere have some kind of basic level of, you know, it's illegal to cause inhumane suffering on the part of states. So that becomes enshrined into the UN Charter. Then there's other like ancillary goals like environmental protection that honestly nobody pays attention to, which is really sad because now we're reaping what we've sown as a result of environmental destruction. But supposedly that's part of the UN mission too, is sustainability for future generations. It's got a much stronger constitution than the League of Nations. The UN is a lot more organized and given more teeth. The UN kind of shows like the top 5 countries of the world, what the global food chain looks like basically after World War II, because there are 5 permanent seats on the UN Security Council, which is the most powerful and important part of the United Nations. Basically, these 5 countries, along with other rotating members, vote on important measures like whether to embargo certain countries for breaking international law, whether to send peacekeepers to different nations to help maintain order and prevent human rights disasters from happening. They could even authorize a full-scale invasion of another country if all 5 countries are on board, right? And this is what happens with the Korean War in 1950. It's a United Nations sanctioned invasion of Korea, of North Korea. So the 5 permanent members are obviously the United States, and obviously the Soviet Union, which today it's Russia. But also the UK, so Great Britain and France are also allowed in because they still have some kind of prestige after World War II, even though they don't do anything without American permission anymore. And also China. And at the time when the UN was created, China was not a communist country at that point. They were going through something of a civil war, and that civil war doesn't resolve itself until the early 1950s, but they're not communist yet. So from the perspective of the creators of the United Nations, they're like, okay, we've got like 4 non-communist countries and the Soviet Union. We're good. Well, it turns out China becomes communist, and we ended up kind of screwing ourselves by allowing China to have that much power, which they still do today. And they veto a bunch of stuff that the West would rather do in terms of human rights and stuff like that. So oopsie daisies. But each of these 5 permanent Security Council members has a veto over what goes on in sanctioned United Nations work. And the idea was to force the most powerful nations of the world to work together, right? If each one of them has a veto, then they all need to agree on certain things. They need to compromise. They need to come to the table with commonality. Sometimes this works. A lot of times it doesn't. It's not a perfect system. And it has certainly failed many, many times. But the most unique tool that the UN has is peacekeeping forces. Each member country kind of donates a fraction of the forces of manpower and materiel and things like that. It's this global police force, and it has been involved in certain moments in the world, such as creating Israel, the old Jewish homeland in the Eastern Mediterranean. It used to be a British protectorate after World War I. Before that, it was just kind of land that was dominated by the Ottoman Empire. But the creation of Israel is a United Nations project, and that happened in 1947. And I'm not going to say anything else about Israel, right? Because I'm going to get in trouble with somebody, whatever I say. But nevertheless, Israel was created as a sovereign country in 1947 as a result of the United Nations. And as a result of the Holocaust. You know, we're like, the Jews need a homeland. Here we go. We're going to create it, right? Whether you agree with that or not, you know, is up to you. There's a genocide convention led by the UN to say, hey, here's what genocide is. We're going to create a legal definition of it. And if we see anybody out there in the world violating this definition of genocide, right, like carrying out genocide, then the UN has a legal responsibility to send in peacekeeping troops to stop yet another Holocaust from happening. That was the idea. It has worked in some cases. It's worked in cases usually closer to the creation of the UN, back when it was stronger. Not so much recently. The Korean War, like I mentioned before, if you watched, has anyone watched MASH, the old show MASH?
Huh?
I've seen some parts of it.
It holds up as a show. If you can find, I don't know where you'd find it. I think Peacock, maybe? I think NBC has the rights. So if you have, like, I don't know, a Peacock subscription, I think you can watch MASH there. I would check it out because even though it's a really old show, it's really funny. Like, it holds up really well. I used to watch it as a kid. I watched reruns. It takes place during the Korean War. It's about American soldiers who are there and they don't really know why. They're like, why are we in Korea? And all they want to do is get out. So they find kind of comedic situations to keep sane, basically. And it's a really, really good show. Like, just trust me, it's better than most stuff on TV today. I'm not just saying that because I'm old, or maybe I am. I don't know. Some of the notable failures. I don't want to just sit here and say the UN is awesome, because it's not. It has several failures under its resume. The Bangladeshi genocide, which, surprise, there's creeping genocides happening in that part of the world today. 1971, there's complete failure of the UN to stop that from happening. One of the most notable failures in recent memory was Rwanda in 1994. So this is within my lifetime, maybe not some of you guys, but UN peacekeeping troops were withdrawn from Rwanda in the midst of a roiling civil war, and a genocide broke out between the Hutus and Tutsis in that country, and a lot of people died. So the UN is not necessarily this, like, you know, bastion of global peacekeeping and order that it pretends to be sometimes. It has lots of failures and other failures I could probably talk about too. If you're interested, you guys have probably seen maybe one or two crash course videos. I'll post on Blackboard the Cold War crash course video if you're more interested in what else happens during the Cold War. I'm going to go through it rather quickly next week. and we're going to wrap it up and move on to like kind of the more contemporary period. But I'll post that for you guys to watch in case you're interested in stuff like, you know, Vietnam, like getting more information on like the Vietnam War, the Cuban Missile Crisis, other kind of flashpoints during the Cold War that are honestly, I think, pretty interesting. But I wouldn't be able to do them justice today. So, all right. Well, any questions or comments or anything before we go?
Will those slides be up on the Blackboard weekly module?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Yep, I'm going to put those up as soon as we are done here, along with the recording, and yeah, you can view those anytime you want.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, you bet.
Thanks.
All right. Thanks, guys. Have a good one. I'll see you on Friday. We'll talk about the documents this week. So see you later.
Thank you.